I didn't say a word when they handed me that eviction notice. The man in the tailored suit across the table smiled like he'd already won, his pen tapping against the HOA letterhead as if the sound itself was hammering the final nail into my family's history. Behind him, framed maps of the new Willowbrook Estates shimmered under the fluorescent light. 35 homes, each labeled with some designer's dream name: Lakeside Haven, The Oaks, Maple Retreat. They called it a community. I called it theft. I just slid a single sheet of paper across the table, an old yellow deed dated 1923. The man barely glanced at it before frowning. "What's this?" he asked. I looked him in the eyes, steady and cold. "Water rights," I said. He laughed like I'd handed him a grocery receipt. But his smile faltered when he saw the notary's seal and the Army Corps of Engineers' signature. He didn't understand yet, none of them did, that I wasn't bluffing. They'd built their empire on stolen land, and I was about to remind them what happens when you build on ground you don't own. The Willowbrook Estates HOA thought they were untouchable, pompous, arrogant, drunk on suburban perfection. They'd paved over my grandfather's grazing fields, cut down the pecan grove where I'd learned to shoot, and replaced the sound of cicadas and cattle with the hum of golf carts. They built their tennis courts and their infinity pools, all downstream of a small, forgotten dam, one my grandfather and the Corps built in 1978. Back then, it was just a modest structure of earth and stone, designed to collect rainwater for dry months. But Pops had engineered it with the same care he gave to everything else. I remember standing beside him as a boy, watching him measure the outflow, listening as he said, "Jake, water is patient. It waits. It remembers. I never forgot that." Years later, when I joined the Army Corps of Engineers, I realized how right he was. When I came back from my second tour in Afghanistan, my land was gone. Sold, subdivided, parceled, and paved without a single call or letter. The county clerk shrugged when I showed him the old survey maps. "Eminent domain," he said. "You can fight it, but the developers already poured concrete." My lawyer told me it was hopeless, that the HOA's corporate backers had deeper pockets than I could imagine. So I stopped fighting, on the outside at least. Inside, I started planning. I moved back into the farmhouse that still stood on the hill above the valley. The same farmhouse Pops built in 1955, its white paint now peeling, the wind whistling through its gaps like the ghosts of everything they'd taken from us. From my porch, I could see their shiny roofs glinting under the Texas sun, like scales on a silver snake slithering across my land. Every evening I'd sit there, beer in hand, staring at the dam at the bottom of the hill, patient, silent, waiting. The HOA meetings were my entertainment. They built their little suburban government, complete with committees for landscaping, noise control, and lawn color uniformity. They'd drive by in golf carts, their visors and pastel polos glowing like some absurd ritual uniform. I watched them argue over mailbox heights and trash bin placement while pretending that their homes weren't built on someone else's legacy. And then came the day they made their final mistake. The new president of the HOA, a woman named Karen, of course, decided that my unsightly dam was a hazard to their community. She sent me a notice demanding that I remove it. I almost laughed when I read it. Remove the dam? The one built before their HOA even existed. The one authorized and registered with federal water rights under my family name. That was the moment I knew they'd signed their own fate. I didn't rush. Revenge, like water, works best when it builds pressure slowly. I started maintenance on the dam, officially, of course. I filed all the right permits, called in old contacts from the Corps to verify everything was within code. The HOA didn't pay attention. They were too busy holding their wine-tasting fundraisers and posting pictures of their picturesque lakeside view, the irony almost poetic. They had no idea that the lake view was about to become literal. By early spring, the rains came heavy and frequent. Central Texas storms, the kind that roll in like black curtains and leave behind rivers where fields used to be. My dam had always held steady, designed to withstand far worse. But what they didn't realize was that the spillway could be adjusted. That night, as thunder echoed over the hills and lightning painted the valley white, I stood in the rain at the control gate. The air smelled like wet soil and electricity. Every drop of rain was another drumbeat, another warning. I thought of Pops, of the years he spent caring for this land. And I thought of the HOA president, the eviction notice, the laughter in that conference room. I turned the wheel one notch, just one. The water hissed through the sluice, louder than I remembered. The dam shuddered, alive again after decades of rest. Downstream, the floodlights of Willowbrook flickered as the first waves reached their manicured lawns. The next morning, I brewed coffee on the porch and watched as the valley shimmered under a rising sun. Where the HOA's cul-de-sacs once lay, now stretched a calm, glistening lake. Mailboxes peaked just above the waterline. Roofs floated like lily pads. The sound of frogs had replaced the hum of lawnmowers. Nature had taken back what was hers. I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. It wasn't destruction I wanted. It was balance. And balance, at last, had been restored. By noon, the news vans had arrived. You could hear the helicopters before you saw them, that low mechanical hum slicing through the air above the drowned rooftops. Reporters stood knee-deep in water, their reflective jackets flashing as they shouted into microphones, talking about an unexpected flood and tragic loss of property. Nobody mentioned the word justice. I sat in my truck halfway up the ridge, sipping coffee from a metal thermos, watching them through binoculars. It wasn't pride that held me there, it was closure. The land had been waiting for this moment, and now it had taken its breath back. The dam stood solid behind me, the overflow cascading in white ribbons down the slope, carrying leaves, branches, and fragments of the artificial paradise that had taken root below. I could see a child's bicycle spinning in the current like a lost thought. Somewhere out there, a man shouted about insurance while another cursed the developers. I didn't feel sorry for them. You can't steal a man's home and expect the earth to stay quiet. When I was a kid, Pops used to say that water always finds its way back home. I thought he meant it as a metaphor, but standing there, I understood what he really meant. Water doesn't care about fences or property lines. It doesn't care about paperwork or signatures. It remembers where it came from, and it goes there, no matter who stands in the way. That morning, Willowbrook Estates learned that lesson the hard way. Still, I didn't leave. I knew the sheriff would come. I knew someone would connect the dots, and I wasn't going to hide. The first squad car arrived just after noon. Sheriff Donnelly stepped out, his boots splashing through the mud, hat pulled low to keep off the drizzle. We'd known each other for years. He was the one who came to tell my mother when Pops passed. He didn't look angry, just tired. "Jake," he said, voice steady but edged, "what the hell did you do?" I didn't answer at first. I just handed him the deed, same one I'd slid across that table months ago. He read it, eyes moving slow, lips tightening. "These water rights, are you telling me this was all legal?" I nodded. "Every inch of it," I said. "They built downstream without permits. They knew. They just thought I wouldn't do anything." The sheriff sighed, glancing down at the drowned community. "Son, legal or not, this is going to be a mess." I looked at him then, really looked at him. "It already was," I said quietly. "They just didn't notice until it got wet." By afternoon, the HOA's board members gathered in a half-submerged community center. Their designer suits were soaked, their perfect hair plastered to their foreheads. Karen, the president, was still trying to hold on to authority like a captain shouting orders from a sinking ship. "This man has to be arrested!" she screamed. "He sabotaged us!" I watched from the doorway as she ranted, her manicured fingers pointing in my direction. I didn't move. "You built on my land," I said evenly. "You ignored every letter, every warning, every law. You thought your money could rewrite history." She started to speak, but I cut her off. "You didn't just build on my property. You built over my grandfather's grave." The room went silent. Nobody knew what to say. Pops was buried on the hill behind the farmhouse overlooking the dam. The same hill they'd wanted to level for their Phase 2 expansion. The developers had called it unoccupied high ground. They had no idea how wrong they were. The state officials arrived by sunset, men in waders, clipboards in hand, trying to make sense of the damage. They took measurements, photos, drone footage. I gave statements, calm and clear. Everything I said matched the records. The dam had been maintained, the gates had been adjusted within regulation limits, the floodplain data was public. The truth was simple, nature had done the rest. Behind the bureaucracy and the paperwork, though, I could see their unease. None of them wanted to admit what everyone was beginning to realize. The HOA had built on restricted floodplain land. Every blueprint, every permit. They'd cut corners, greased hands, and ignored warnings. And now the water had exposed it all. That night I sat by the dam again, the rain gone, the sky clear and starlit. The floodwater below shimmered like molten glass, reflecting fragments of the ruined development. Shingles, fences, patio furniture, pieces of a dream that never should have existed. Somewhere out there, a single light blinked from a half-submerged house. Maybe a generator, maybe a stubborn soul refusing to leave. I respected that. Survival always deserved respect. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl into the cold night air. The frogs were singing again. The world was settling into its new shape. I thought about Pops and how he used to hum when fixing fences. I thought about the nights I'd spent overseas, patching canals, redirecting rivers in deserts where water was life itself. I thought about coming home to find my mother's house surrounded by strangers' lawns. And I thought about every lawyer, every clerk, every official who told me I'd lost. Maybe on paper I had. But standing there, looking over the water, I realized something they'd never understand. I didn't destroy Willowbrook Estates. I just reminded the land of what it used to be. When the reporters finally found me the next morning, I didn't hide my face. A young woman with a camera asked if I felt guilty. Guilty? I repeated, almost smiling. For what? Letting water flow where it's supposed to? She frowned, clearly expecting remorse, something clean and quotable for the 6 o'clock news. But I had none to give. They called it progress, I said softly, but progress built on theft isn't progress. It's rot. The camera's red light blinked as she nodded uncertainly. Somewhere behind her, a man in a soaked polo shirt shouted that he'd sue me for everything I had left. I didn't respond. You can't sue the rain. As I walked away, the ground squelched beneath my boots, each step heavy but certain. The dam hummed quietly behind me, content. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not triumph, not vengeance, just a quiet knowing that things had found their balance again. The HOA would rebuild, of course. They always do. They'd pump out the water, replant their lawns, repaint their fences, but no matter how much they spent, they could never drain the memory of that night. The land would remember, the water would remember, and so would I. Weeks passed before the water began to recede. What was once a mirror of destruction slowly turned into a lake, quiet, deep, and oddly serene. The insurance adjusters came first, then the contractors, then the lawsuits. Every channel in Texas ran the story for a week straight. Man opens dam, HOA subdivision flooded. They played my face over and over, sometimes painted as a villain, sometimes as a folk hero. It depended on who was telling the story, but none of them understood the truth. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. The land had called for balance, and I had simply answered. The dam had done what it was built to do, protect the watershed, regulate the flow. The problem was never the dam. It was the arrogance that thought it could control nature with property lines and bylaws. I kept mostly to myself in those weeks. The farmhouse had survived untouched, sitting high above the flood like a silent witness. I'd wake before sunrise, brew coffee on the old stove, and sit on the porch while mist curled up from the new lake below. The birds came back first. Egrets, herons, ducks that hadn't nested here in decades. Sometimes I'd see deer waiting near the water's edge, cautious but curious, reclaiming what had always been theirs. The silence was different now. It wasn't the empty kind that follows loss. It was alive, humming with renewal. I could almost feel Pops there with me, humming his old tune under his breath. The land felt whole again. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. The HOA's remaining board members tried to rebuild their little empire. They talked about drainage projects, emergency levees, and reconstruction plans. But the more they studied, the clearer it became that rebuilding here was pointless. The soil was too soft, the floodplain too active. Nature had redrawn the map. By the time summer came, most of the residents had packed what they could salvage and left. A few houses were hauled off in pieces. Others were left to rot quietly under the sun. They called it a disaster zone. I called it a wetland. One afternoon, a young reporter came back, the same woman who'd interviewed me that first week. Her tone was softer now, less hungry for headlines. She asked if she could walk the property with me. I agreed. We hiked down toward the waterline, boots sinking into the damp earth. "You know," she said, "people online are calling you the Dam Man. Some think you're a hero. Others say you destroyed millions in property value." I smiled faintly. "Funny thing about value," I said, "it depends on what you measure." She looked around. The tall reeds swaying, frogs chirping, water glinting gold under the setting sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's honest," I corrected. She nodded, understanding more than her camera ever could. We stood there a long while before she asked the question everyone wanted answered. If you could go back, before all this, would you still do it? I thought about that for a long moment. The wind brushed against the tall grass, whispering like the voice of the past. Finally, I said, yes, but I'd do it slower. I'd give them time to see what they were destroying before it drowned them. She didn't press further. Some truths don't need to be dissected. They just need to be heard. When she left, I watched her car disappear down the gravel road that wound through what used to be Willowbrook Drive. The sign still stood half buried in mud, its once white letters cracked and faded. "Willowbrook Estates," it read, now leaning toward the water like a tombstone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Names have power, Pops used to say. Maybe that's why I left it there, to remind anyone passing through of what happens when greed forgets humility. By late autumn, word spread that the state had officially reclassified the area as a conservation zone. The Corps had sent surveyors and ecologists to study the lake, now home to migratory birds and freshwater fish. The same agency that had helped Pops design the dam in 1978 now recognized its ecological importance. They even offered to buy the land for preservation. I refused the first offer, not because of money, but because of principle. I wasn't ready to let go. This land wasn't for sale. It was home. On the first cool night of November, I walked down to the dam one last time before winter set in. The moon was full, turning the water silver. The air smelled like cedar and wet soil, the kind of scent that seeps into your bones. I traced my hand along the concrete lip, feeling the rough texture beneath my fingers. I thought about everything that had happened, the meetings, the laughter, the anger, the flood. It all seemed distant now, like a dream retold too many times. What remained was simple, the land breathing easy again. I sat down on the old wooden bench Pops had built near the spillway. It was worn smooth by time, its grain dark from years of rain and sun. I closed my eyes and listened. There it was again, the faint, rhythmic pulse of water against stone. It wasn't loud, not violent or angry. It was steady, calm, patient, like a heartbeat. And in that sound, I could almost hear him. "Water remembers, Jake. It always does." I smiled into the darkness. He was right. Sometime later, I began planting trees along the ridges, native oaks, pecans, and willows. Each one a promise to the land that it would never be forgotten again. I didn't need fences or signs to mark ownership anymore. The roots would do that better than any deed. When neighbors asked why I was doing it, I'd just say, because someone has to remember where we came from. Some nodded politely. Others didn't understand. That was fine. Understanding wasn't a requirement. Respect was, years from now, maybe someone will stumble upon this place and see only a quiet lake surrounded by trees. Maybe they'll never know about the flood, the greed, the dam, or the man who opened it. Maybe they'll just see beauty, and that's enough. Because beauty, real beauty, doesn't come from perfection. It comes from truth. And the truth of this land was simple. It wasn't theirs to take. It never was. When the wind rose that night, it carried the scent of rain again. I looked up at the clouds forming over the hills and smiled. Let it come, I thought. Let it pour. The dam will hold. It always has. But even if someday it doesn't, even if the waters rise again and the lake spills over its banks, I know one thing for certain. The land will remember. And it will find its way home.